Hello and welcome to Unacademy, a one-stop destination for the English medium civil services aspirants. A very good morning and welcome to the daily Hindu news analysis. So let's begin our discussion by first looking at the topics that we are going to discuss. From the Delhi edition of the Hindu, I have chosen 10 important articles for a detailed and comprehensive coverage so that you don't have to go back and read the newspaper again. So before we start the discussion, please ensure you join our official Telegram channel by scanning the QR code because after the session ends, we will be sharing the PDF over here. So with this, let's get started and look at the first article. We have a very important column on page number 10 that is relevant for science and technology and as well as for Indian polity. This topic deals with DNA as evidence in criminal investigations. This topic is in the news because recently the Supreme Court of India has laid down a set of guidelines to bring uniformity and to ensure that there are standard protocols in place when it comes to collection of DNA evidence, the storage and packaging of the DNA evidence, and the chain of custody of the DNA evidence. Because what if the DNA samples are not properly collected? What if the DNA sample collected at a crime scene is contaminated? And what if the DNA samples are tampered with after it has been collected? And what if there is no rigorous check on the chain of custody when it is held by the investigating officer that is representing the police forces? So that is the reason why the Supreme Court has stepped in and it has laid down a set of guidelines and standard protocols to be followed. The Supreme Court has directed the DGPs of all the state police to come out with a standard set of guidelines and protocols and dispatch these guidelines to the district level so that it can be followed all across the country. So, in this context, we need to understand the role of DNA evidence in criminal investigation. We need to understand what issues are present. Is it accepted as evidence in a criminal trial? And that is what we will break down in today's session. Now, before we discuss this further, why don't we take up a prelims practice question? Let's see if you guys can answer this. With reference to the use of DNA evidence in criminal investigations in India, consider the following statements. So two statements have been given. The first statement says DNA evidence is admissible in Indian courts as conclusive substantial evidence. The second statement says the Criminal Procedure Identification Act 2022 allows the collection of biological samples, including DNA, from convicts and certain categories of accused. So, which of these statements are correct? Can you please let me know in the comments? Take a few seconds and let me know what could be the right answer. Is DNA evidence admissible in Indian courts? And if admissible, is it treated as conclusive substantial proof of the guilt of the accused? Yes or no? Then, under the Criminal Procedure Identification Act, is it legally allowed to collect biological samples, including DNA specimen of the convicts and the other categories of accused? So let's see how many of you can get the right answer. Can we see the comment section? Okay. See, if you look at the answer here would be option B. 2 only is the correct answer. Statement 1 is incorrect and 2 is a correct statement. Let me explain this in slight detail. DNA evidence is admissible in Indian courts under the Indian Evidence Act, the erstwhile Indian Evidence Act, and the Bharatiya Sakshya Adhiniyam, which has replaced the Indian Evidence Act. DNA evidence is admissible in Indian courts, but however, it is not seen as conclusive substantial proof of the guilt of the accused. It is only considered as opinion evidence. It has some probatory value, meaning it can be used for further investigations. But DNA evidence alone will not establish the guilt of the accused. There should be other evidences as well, which should add up. For example, it could be eyewitness accounts, other technical digital evidence, forensics, right? Plus, the motive has to be clearly established. The murder weapon, in case of murders, has to be found. So all these other evidences also play a big role. So DNA evidence alone is not treated as conclusive substantive proof. It's only seen as opinion evidence, but it is admissible in the Indian courts. But statement becomes incorrect because it is not conclusive or substantial evidence. It is only opinion evidence. Second statement is absolutely right. Biological samples, including DNA specimen, can be collected of the accused and the convicts as per the Criminal Procedure Identification Act. Now, based on this, let's break down the topic. Let's go beyond the article. DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid. It essentially encodes the genetic sequence in living organisms. And the sequence is unique for each individual. So essentially, it's a unique signature of each and every individual, each and every specimen. So at a crime scene, DNA samples, if they are collected appropriately, stored appropriately, tested properly, it could be of great evidentiary value. It can be used to probe the case further, to identify the suspects, to narrow down the suspects. And with other additional proof and evidence, you can essentially get hold of the actual culprit. So DNA evidence has completely revolutionized the world of criminal investigations. There is no doubt about it. Now, be it a case of rape or a murder or even a terror attack or a case of robbery, in any such criminal cases, collecting DNA samples at the site, at the scene of the crime, is of great importance. Now, as of today, though there are certain guidelines made by the police forces at the state level, there is absolutely no uniformity. There are no SOPs, standard operating protocols in place. Across the nation, state police follow different set of standards and guidelines. There is no uniform set of standards. Now, you might argue that police and public order is a state subject under the 7th schedule of the Indian Constitution. So there need not be uniformity which is enforced from the center. That's correct. But when it comes to the trial of these cases, if uniformity is not maintained, if standard protocols are not established, then the very value of the DNA evidence will come into question in the court. And this evidence could even be dismissed by the courts. So, to ensure the appropriate usage of forensics technology, it is important to streamline this process, put in place these standard operating protocols or procedures, have standard guidelines that is followed across the country. That is the reason why the Supreme Court of India has stepped in and directed the DGPs of all the state police to come out with a set of standards. So please make a note. The DGPs have been directed with the Supreme Court to come out with a set of standards based on the guidelines that are laid down by the Supreme Court itself. For example, the Supreme Court has directed that the investigating officer who is responsible for the investigation should be present with a medical professional while the DNA sample is collected. And while the DNA sample is being collected, all the required data and documents will have to be appropriately updated. The date, the place, the time, the coding of the sample of the specimen, everything has to be done appropriately by the investigating officer in the presence of a medical professional. So there should be a standard process for this. Adequate care has to be ensured that there is no contamination of the DNA sample. If the crime scene is not contained, if others have walked in and walked out or touched the objects over there, obviously the DNA samples would be contaminated. So collecting such DNA samples could not be of any value, or it could even mislead and misdirect the investigation. So to ensure this doesn't happen, it's important to collect the sample, the evidence properly. So for that, the investigation officer has to be appropriately trained. He should be aware of the protocols which are present, and it should be followed in the presence of a medical professional, and all the required data, documents will have to be collected, updated. Documentation is equally important. Then after collecting the sample, the sample has to be transported. Usually, the practice is that it is immediately transported to the nearest police station, wherever the case is being investigated, under whose jurisdiction it comes, or it is taken to the nearest hospital for cryo storage. So, this has to happen immediately. The transport of the sample, which has been collected, to the concerned police station or the hospital should be done ASAP. And within 48 hours of collecting the sample, it should be submitted to the forensics laboratory. It should be submitted to the FSLs, the forensic science laboratories, where the sample would be analyzed and based on which the DNA evidence could be used to further probe the particular case. So these standards have to be put in place. Then even the chain of custody, because criminal investigations and trials might drag for many months, many years, and until the case reaches a logical conclusion, that is, unless and until the case is finally resolved by the courts, where the accused is held guilty or they're acquitted, until then the samples, the evidence has to be preserved, and it should be ensured that nobody tampers with the evidence in between. So for this, you need a proper documentation process. A standard protocol should be put in place to ensure the sanctity of the chain of custody. The samples will pass different hands. From the investigating officer, it will pass on to the hospitals or the police station or the FSL labs. From there, it could pass to the courts, where it might be presented as evidence. Then it might be taken back and stored in the FSL labs or with the police itself. So the samples will keep moving for a long time until the case reaches a logical conclusion. So to ensure it's not tampered with, it's not meddled with, it's not contaminated, there should be a proper chain of custody which is very well documented, which can be verified with the courts. The sample should never be opened once it is collected, once the testing is done. It should not be opened again. And these protocols, they are what, that is what is required to ensure that DNA evidence is of some evidentiary value in a criminal investigation. So that is why the Supreme Court has directly stepped into the domain of the state police, directed the DGPs to come out with standard protocols and guidelines and ensure that this uniformity is maintained. Is that clear? So, talking about its evidentiary value, DNA evidence is acceptable in Indian courts. It is accepted, but it is only considered as opinion evidence. As per the provisions of the erstwhile Indian Evidence Act and the current Bharatiya Sakshya Adhiniyam, it's only seen as opinion evidence, which is of a further value for investigations, but it is not substantive and conclusive evidence of the guilt of the accused. Clear? So I hope this topic is clearly understood, both from the perspective of criminal law and as well as from the perspective of science and technology. So based on this, you can expect a mains question. So let's look at the question and develop the answer writing approach for this one. Examine the role of DNA evidence in criminal investigations. Why strict protocols and guidelines are necessary to ensure the sanctity of this form of evidence. So there are two different parts in this question. So in the introduction, you can talk about how DNA evidence has completely transformed criminal investigations. Maybe if you're aware of any breakthrough cases where a murder or a rape and had occurred and the police made a big breakthrough, because of the DNA evidence, they managed to collect and store appropriately and used it uh, as a backup evidence to get the convicts held guilty by the courts. So if you're aware of any such cases, right, you can quote that as an example and you can explain the transformative role of DNA evidence in criminal investigation. So this example can be from the Indian context or even from the global context. Now, once the introduction is done, in the body, provide some details about DNA based evidence. A little bit of scientific details, like what is DNA, how it is unique to each individual, how each specimen can be almost perfectly identified with the individual, and how the samples are collected. It can be collected from hair samples, semen samples, vaginal swabs, bodily fluids, right? Skin tissue, bone marrow. So just give examples of that. Just present the scientific argument as to how DNA evidence is unique to each individual, how it can be a biomarker, a bioindicator of that particular individual. So then talk about the importance of proper collection, storage, transport, custody, and of course, proper testing. Now, this is extremely critical. Without that, DNA evidence has absolutely no value, correct? So, talk about the need for uniformity in this process. How it is important to maintain the credibility of the evidence, the sanctity of this evidence by ensuring that it is properly collected, stored, transported, tested properly, and the chain of custody is established and maintained. So, this is something you can discuss. Here, you can talk about the shortcomings which are present currently. For example, sometimes investigating officers are not properly trained. Sometimes the crime scene is already contaminated even before the samples are lifted, right? It's very important to isolate the crime scene, which usually doesn't happen in the Indian context. So, this again has to do with the training of the local police. So, mention these shortcomings: the appropriate storage, proper testing, how it should be transported on time. For example, recently there was one case in Delhi where the Delhi police had solid DNA proof to ensure that the convict, the accused, would be proven guilty. But the problem was the police, they kept the DNA evidence with them for 2 months before they transferred it to the FSL. After it was collected, right? Ideally, the guidelines states that it should be transported to the FSL labs within 48 hours. But Delhi police, they ignored the protocols. They kept their samples with them for almost 2 months and then gave it to the FSL labs for DNA testing. The courts dismissed the evidence because in that period of 2 months, anything could have happened. The DNA sample could have been naturally contaminated, or maybe someone with a wrong intention could have tampered with the evidence. So, how can you trust that evidence? And courts will dismiss such evidence if there is a failure of protocols. So, point this out with examples and suggest how it can be plugged, how shortcomings can be plugged by maintaining uniformity, how these shortcomings can be rectified by maintaining uniformity in the entire process. And for maintaining uniformity, you need guidelines and SOPs. That's it. You can point out the Supreme Court has recently directed the DGPs of all the state police forces to come out with these guidelines and ensure that there is uniformity across the country. You can even mention in the conclusion that DNA evidence is accepted in Indian courts, but as opinion evidence, not as substantive evidence. But still, it can guide the investigation and it can essentially become a big breakthrough in very difficult cases, right? That can be the conclusion to end this answer. So now let's look at the next article on page number 10 that focuses on plastic pollution. This again is a very interesting article because it consists of a lot of data. A lot of facts have been provided in this article, which I feel can be very useful for your prelims and mains exam. So please concentrate. And I hope all of you are taking notes as well as we discuss. And I want you guys to make notes of the points that we are going to discuss under this article. See, plastic pollution, global plastics treaty, which is being negotiated. We have covered this topic several times. But the reason why I chose this topic again is not because of the topic alone, but in the article, there are some interesting data pointers and facts which are given, which you won't find it easily otherwise. And you can directly use this in your mains answers. Maybe there is an essay topic on plastic pollution or on environmental problems, right? Or maybe there is a prelims question, which is very factual and specific. So the facts and data given here could be extremely useful to answer such questions. So let's talk about plastic pollution. Recently, OECD, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, it's an economic grouping of the developed West European countries. This organization has published a report on the global plastic problem. Please make a note of the report, the Global Plastic Outlook. This itself can come as a prelims question. UPSC might ask you, Which organization publishes the Global Plastic Outlook? It is the OECD. According to this report, over the last 2 decades, from the year 2000 to 2019, plastic production has doubled around the world. In 2019, the global plastic production was somewhere around 460 million tons. In 1999 2000, it was just around 220 to 30 million tons. So, plastic production around the world has more than doubled in just 2 decades. And out of this, the plastic waste being generated has jumped significantly to 353 million tons. And if I give you the data for 2024, you will be shocked even further because global plastic production and consumption is rising every year, especially in the last 3 to 4 years. As of 2024, global plastic production stands at 500 million tons. The waste which is being generated stands at 400 million tons. And out of this, a very small percentage of it is being treated and recycled. That is the serious concern when it comes to plastic pollution. According to estimates, if we continue on this path, by 2060, plastic production will hit 1.2 billion tons. And you can guess how much of it could be plastic waste, which will end up in landfills, which will end up in our ecosystem, and will continue to pollute for decades to come. Plastic has a detrimental impact on environmental health and human health. It can disrupt the entire food chains. So, given the long term disruptive effect of plastics, it is very critical to curb the production, manage the waste scientifically. That is the need of the hour. And that is what the report is trying to highlight. If we continue on this path, global plastic production will easily hit $1.2 billion. It will cross 1.2 billion tons by 2060. It's also a major contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. So, in this context, it is important to identify the industries, the sources where plastic is being produced and consumed at the maximum levels. The packaging sector is obviously the biggest consumer, and this is where the highest consumption happens. Then, consumer goods, textiles, electronics. These are some of the industrial sectors which are the biggest consumers of plastics, especially single use plastic, which is used to package the item. There are safer alternatives available, but it might be costlier, it might be more expensive, it might be difficult to procure. So, most companies prefer the easier path, and there is widespread plastic consumption which is happening. And the problem is, it's not being scientifically handled when it turns into waste. See, according to the OECD report, two-thirds of the global plastic which is produced and consumed, almost 75% of it, its lifespan ends within 5 years, meaning that plastic is not used for more than 5 years. So, very quickly, it will end up as waste. And this waste is not scientifically managed. That is where the real problem lies. Now, when you look at plastic waste management, there is a serious concern that even in developed countries, plastic is not being scientifically handled, processed, and recycled. At this rate, by the middle of this century, by 2050, the world oceans will have more plastic than the fish it contains. That tells you the seriousness, the environmental crisis that we are going to face in the coming years. The Ocean Conservancy data, which is a marine think tank that focuses on conservation of the oceans, it says that every year 11 million tons of this plastic is entering our marine ecosystems. And over the decades, we've already released more than 200 million tons of plastic into the marine ecosystem. So, this is the seriousness of the problem. Now, what are we doing with the plastic waste? Where is it ending up? Now, if you look at plastic waste management, hardly 9% of it is being recycled. This is the best optimistic estimate. Let's say there is 100 million tons of plastic waste, just around 9 million tons would be recycled out of it. 50% of it is being dumped in landfills. Maybe around 19% is being burnt in incinerators. So burning plastic and dumping it in landfill is not the right or appropriate way to deal with plastic waste. When you dump plastic in landfills, it will eventually start breaking down. It will start leaching some of the toxic neurotoxins present in it, and it will break down into small, fine particles, which we call as microplastics, nanoplastics. It will enter the soil system, the groundwater table, the water system, and eventually it will find its way into the food chain itself. Burning plastic as well is not the right appropriate solution. Burning plastic will simply release greenhouse gases because plastic is produced primarily as a byproduct of petrochemical industry. The virgin plastic polymer, the primary source of plastic production, it is entirely petrochemical. The raw materials are petrochemical. So when you burn this, you're going to release for greenhouse gases. And estimates already indicate that the plastic industry is contributing 3.4% of the total greenhouse gas emissions today. And the UNEP has an even more alarming estimate that by 2040, plastic industry alone will account for 19% of the global carbon budget. So this could accelerate climate change, global warming in the coming years. So it is absolutely critical to deal with this problem on a war footing. As plastic breaks down because it is non-biodegradable, right? It does not decompose. It will only undergo weathering under the elements of nature. It will break down into small, fine particles, micro nanoplastics, and it will enter all the ecosystems, terrestrial to aquatic ecosystems, and it will start essentially accumulating in the food chain. So as you move up the food chain, you will see higher concentration of plastic. So studies have recently found very alarming levels of plastic in human bodies, in embryos, and even in infants, in marine organisms. So that is the scale of the problem that we are dealing with. And studies have established that plastic in our body can be having a detrimental health impact, not just on humans, on every animal, bird, fish. Plastics are known to be carcinogens. They are known to be endocrine disruptors, which will play with your hormonal production, hormonal levels. It is known to release neurotoxins, which could lead to a slow poisoning. So this will have a serious health impact apart from its environmental impact. And that is the reason why there needs to be greater focus on reducing plastic consumption, bringing down the production itself, switching to better alternatives, and eventually handling the waste in a more scientific manner. So, for this purpose, the UN Environment Programme in 2022 has established the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee, the INC, to negotiate the first ever global plastics treaty. So countries had met in Nairobi, in Kenya, for the UN Environment Assembly session of the UN Environment Programme, where all the UN members agreed, the 193 member states agreed to establish a INC, a Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee, and they gave themselves a deadline that within 2024 they'll come out with a legally binding global plastics treaty. This was the goal they set for themselves, that they will come out with a global treaty to cap the production of plastics and to find and replace that with better alternatives, and to place legal obligations on countries to better manage the plastic waste. So several rounds of negotiations have taken place. The first ever INC was hosted by Uruguay in 2022. The second INC was hosted by France in Paris. The third session of the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee was held again in Nairobi, in Kenya. Then the fourth session took place in Canada. And recently, the fifth session took place in Busan, South Korea. The first part of the fifth session. The second part of the fifth session was held just last month in Geneva, in Switzerland. So until now, multiple INC sessions have taken place. 6 INC sessions have been held. and still we do not have a global plastics treaty because the world is divided. There are few countries, especially European countries, which are fixing, which are basically pushing for a fixed cap, a strict capping on plastic production, and a eventual ban on the usage of plastic and switch to cleaner alternatives. But this is not acceptable to developing nations and even the major petroleum exporting nations. So, for example, countries such as Saudi Arabia, India, China, and many others. They've opposed placing any strict caps and any ban on plastic usage or having a deadline for plastic production and consumption. So, because of this division, the world has not been able to arrive at a plastics treaty which is legally binding. Hopefully, in the coming months, there should be a treaty which is finalized, but there is strong opposition from petroleum exporting nations because these caps will directly hurt their exports. Then, developing nations of the global south, for them, plastic is a cheaper alternative. So, switching to other alternatives overnight will be expensive for their industry, which could have an economic impact, a socio-economic impact as well. So, global south countries, the developing, underdeveloped nations, are trying to buy more time. They're expecting developed nations to act first. So, it's essentially the same divide that you see in climate change talks as well. So, as a result, the Global Plastics Treaty has not been finalized. So, what is the way forward? Way forward would be one, to finalize a global treaty. Countries have to reach a middle ground. They have to work out a compromise so that they can ensure the economic damage is limited for oil exporting nations, for developing underdeveloped countries. Maybe developed countries can share the cost, the burden of the developing nations. But there should be a legally binding treaty which will cap plastic production, and eventually we should see a switch to safer alternatives. Apart from this, there should be greater focus on recycling, and the plastics treaty has to deal with this. The waste management should be made more scientific. The concept of extended producer responsibility should be codified into international law and national legislations, where the producer of plastic is held responsible for the entire life cycle. And the producer should be responsible to collect the plastic and process this and recycle it. Promotion of recycling is important. Right now, most of the plastic production is happening through the primary route. The virgin plastic polymers which are produced, it's produced through petrochemical feedstock. So we should switch to used old plastic as the primary raw material to produce recycled plastic. That should become the primary source of plastic, what we call as secondary plastics. So there should be a global push towards moving away from virgin primary plastics or polymers produced through petrochemical raw materials and switch towards using the plastic waste to recycle it and produce secondary plastics. Right now, it stands at just 6%. This can be stepped up even further. Right now, recycling at the global level is hardly 6 to 9%. So this can be stepped up. Along with that, you need greater awareness, which media, governments will have to create amongst the consumers, and also ensure there is focus on redesigning the products so that the plastic packaging requirement will go down. You can come up with better design for a product which doesn't require a lot of plastic to be used in packaging, right? You can switch to alternatives. Instead of single use plastic bags, you can switch to paper bags. Instead of plastic straws, cups, cutlery, you can switch to other safer traditional alternatives, right? But however, this fight is very, very challenging because the world is honestly filled with idiots. Recently, we had one such idiot leader who was very happy that plastic straws were back. Can you tell me who was that idiot leader? A country had banned plastic straws, but this idiot basically said that plastic straws are fine, it doesn't kill fish, and he has brought back plastic straws and he's happy about it. He has been publicly speaking how happy he is that plastic straws are back in consumption. So, because of such leadership, the fight against plastic pollution has been weakened as well. Because of the interests of certain nations, the interests of developing nations, the interests of oil exporting nations, the lack of awareness, the lack of support for plastic recycling. All these factors are responsible. So, the way forward is to have a legally binding plastics treaty, which has a fair deadline and a cap so that there is greater burden on the developed nations, which have benefited more from plastic, and a reduced burden on the developing, underdeveloped nations, right? So that the economic damage is limited. And it should push towards a safer alternative in the coming years. Then there should be focus on promoting recycling, concept of extended producer responsibility. Or how about imposing taxes on landfills, which are dumping plastic to the ground? Those landfills, which are basically dumping plastic in the ground, they should pay more taxes. Then if people are disposing plastic, there should be an additional cost placed on them. What you call as pay as you throw system. If you're throwing plastic, you'll have to pay for it. Or if you're recycling plastic, you should be incentivized. You should be paid money if you're collecting plastic and giving it for recycling. These systems at the grassroots is necessary. So based on this understanding, take up this mains practice question. Examine the scale of plastic pollution, its sources and impact, both environmental impact and human health impact. What role should governments and individuals play in curbing plastic use? Now let's look at an important editorial on page number 8. In this editorial, the Hindu is talking about the inflation levels in the country and what prospects does it hold for growth in the Indian economy. Recently, we covered the same topic, but in a brief manner, but now we can have a more detailed discussion. The inflation data, which was recently published, finally points towards a rise in retail inflation to 2.1%. This is not alarming in any way. It's actually good news. Rise in inflation is actually good news because for the last 9 months, retail inflation was dropping consistently. CPI retail inflation was dropping because of lower food, fuel prices and low prices of other essentials. While this is good news for the government because there was adequate supply and sustained constant demand, there was no surge in demand as such. Prices of fruits, vegetables, essential protein sources like dairy products, meat, eggs remained pretty stable and even saw a decline. Prices of essential commodities, fuel also has remained stable. Global oil prices has remained stable. So as a result, inflation, retail inflation was dropping repeatedly for the last 9 months. For the first time, we are seeing a jump in inflation to 2.1%, which is within the range that is prescribed to the Monetary Policy Committee. The Monetary Policy Committee has a target to keep inflation in the 2 to 6% range with an ideal inflation rate of 4%. So 2.1% inflation is still good enough. But now the focus should be on pushing for growth. Indian economy has been performing decently well in the last few months. Same time last year, the situation was very different. Just around 12 to 15 months ago, growth in the Indian economy had slowed down, stagnated, whereas inflation remained persistently higher. This was the challenge that RBI and the government were dealing with last year. But now the situation has really improved. Growth has picked up, definitely, without a doubt. The GDP numbers clearly indicate the shift which is happening in the Indian economy, even from manufacturing, even from agriculture. And inflation is within manageable limits. It's not running out of control. As long as it is in the 2 to 6% band, around the 4% margin, it is absolutely fine. And RBI, the Monetary Policy Committee, can easily manage and contain the situation. Now, if you take the differential here, the differential between growth and inflation numbers last year was somewhere at 2.1%. Now, the differential is 5% because of improved growth and subdued inflation, meaning there is greater propensity for growth without driving up inflation in the immediate future. So this is great news because this can push the Monetary Policy Committee to cut the repo rate, to further fuel growth, introduce more liquidity without the risk of pushing up inflation, right? Even inflation, if it goes up to 3%, 4%, 4.5 to 5%, it is still fine. Until then, the MPC can keep cutting rates for the next few quarters to keep pushing growth by introducing more liquidity. And this can be good news for India. It comes at a very crucial time, especially when India is dealing with a very challenging global environment, especially because of the American tariffs. Now, let's assume India, US, which are trying to restore normalcy in the relationship after Trump's erratic tariffs on India. Let's say we arrive at a trade deal. Finally, a trade deal is worked out. But what if US pressurizes India to cut oil imports from Russia? That's what Trump's administration has been trying to do, to arm twist India, to blackmail India, to cut India's import of Russian oil, hoping that it will force Russia to end the war in Ukraine. So, as part of the trade deal, what if there is significant American pressure on India to cut India's oil imports from Russia? So, we already discussed this point. If India were to do that, under the impact of the tariffs, we might see a drop in our GDP in the range of 0.5 to 0.6%. Maximum impact on GDP would be 1%. Experts are of the opinion India can bear this loss. At current growth levels and inflation levels, we can easily bear this loss and continue our strategic partnership with Russia, continue importing oil from Russia. But let's look at the other alternative. What if India has no other choice? What if India has to fall under American pressure? Of course, from a foreign policy point of view, that would be a compromise on our strategic autonomy. But I'm purely talking about this from an economic perspective. Let's assume for a second US will force India to cut oil imports as part of the trade deal. Can India do that? The answer is yes. The current economic situation allows India to do that. We can end the oil imports from Russia. Why? Because global oil prices have become stable. It is quite low at the moment. So, whatever discount Russians are offering, it's not a big discount that they are providing because global oil prices are already at a lower level and there are alternate suppliers. So, there might be a slight jump in our import cost, but it won't completely disrupt the Indian economy. Maybe in 2022, 2023, Russian discounts mattered more because global oil prices were very high because of all the uncertainty and global chaos. But today, global prices, oil prices have stabilized. So whatever discounts Russians are offering, it's not much. So India can quickly shift to alternate suppliers without much of an impact on our current account deficit. And still, we can come out almost unscathed in this crisis. So there's no necessity per se, no economic necessity for us to depend on Russian oil. There is a geopolitical angle, correct, to protect our strategic all weather ties with Russia and to retain our independent foreign policy. But from an economic perspective, there is nothing holding us back. If we want, we can cut the oil imports from Russia, switch to other suppliers because our growth numbers, our inflation numbers allow us to do that. It will allow us to protect our ties with the US and maybe strike a good deal which can protect Indian exports to the US market. That is the key point the editorial is trying to make. So I hope this is clear. Now let's move on to another interesting development from our neighboring country, Pakistan. Lashkar-e-Toiba has been collecting funds to reconstruct its headquarters in Muridke. That's the interesting development. Just a few months ago, on 7th of May, under Operation Sindoor, Indian armed forces decimated the headquarters of terrorist organizations such as Lashkar-e-Toiba and Jaish-e-Mohammed. India conducted precision strikes at Bahawalpur, aimed at the facilities and headquarters of Jaish-e-Mohammed. Similarly, we struck the headquarters of Lashkar-e-Toiba at Muridke. There is a 1 acre compound which was acting as the headquarters of the Lashkar. And there were three facilities essentially. There was one mosque and one building which housed the trainees, the fresh recruits who were being radicalized, and another building where the senior commanders used to live. All these three buildings were decimated with precision strikes by Indian armed forces. So it was brought to the ground. Now Lashkar is trying to rebuild that infrastructure and it is trying to mobilize funds. And how are they doing it? They are asking for funds in the name of flood relief. As you know, the Indus Basin has been affected by severe floods due to heavy rainfall. Just like Punjab on the Indian side has been flooded, on the Pakistani side as well, there have been massive floods in the Indus, Jhelum, Chenab, and Ravi, Beas, and Satluj. It has caused immense human suffering, agricultural loss for the Pakistani farmers. So Lashkar-e-Toiba has few front organizations which involve in social work, so-called social work. Jamaat-ud-Dawa, JUD, is seen as the primary front for Lashkar-e-Toiba. Now there is another organization as well which acts as a front, Hidamat-e-Khalaf or Khalak. This is another new front entity Lashkar has established as a charitable organization, as a social welfare organization, almost like some sort of an NGO, to raise funds for welfare activities. So the funds they raise, most of it is diverted towards building their terror infrastructure and to sponsor their terrorist activities. And Indian intelligence agencies are aware of this development because we have seen a similar pattern previously as well. In the year 2005, I don't know if you guys remember, in Jammu and Kashmir and Pakistan occupied Kashmir, there was a massive earthquake that brought a lot of destruction on the Indian side and as well as on the Pakistani side, where Pakistan has illegally occupied Indian territory. Following this massive earthquake, even then Lashkar-e-Toiba was raising funds for earthquake relief. They would actually do some social work on the ground. They would be seen posing with Pakistani government and military officials. They would be involved in dispersing medical supplies or food aid for the affected people just to create that good image. And through online and offline sources, through public rallies and online donations, they raised a lot of funds and almost 80% of it was diverted towards terrorist activities. This is a pattern which has been well studied, well tracked by Indian intelligence agencies. So we are seeing a repeat of this following the devastating floods. Jamaat Dawa and Hidamat-e-Khalaq, the front organizations of Lashkar, have been very actively raising funds online and as well as through public rallies. And Pakistani government and the military leadership had publicly declared support for these outfits after Operation Sindoor. The Pakistani government publicly declared that government will give funds to rebuild the terrorist infrastructure. So that is what we are seeing here. And according to Indian intelligence agencies which are tracking this development, Lashkar has given a deadline for itself. By February 5th, 2026, they want to complete the reconstruction to show that whatever damage India caused, that they have overcome that damage and now they are back in business. The reason why they have chosen February 5th is because Lashkar marks this day as Kashmir's so-called Kashmir Solidarity Day, where they basically rally all the jihadist elements and the separatist factions and the terrorist elements to try and instigate trouble in Jammu and Kashmir. In fact, Lashkar-e-Toiba even organizes a so-called convention of jihadists focused on the Kashmir cause, which is backed by Pakistan's ISI. Now look at the disturbing irony here. India, we organize trade conventions, we organize research conventions, technology conventions. Pakistan is organizing jihad conventions. The state enables this, enables Lashkar to hold these conventions, hold public rallies, to mobilize funds. And that is why India is keeping a close watch on these developments. Because Operation Sindoor, though it was a tremendous success, it will not end terrorism per se as long as there is state support from our neighboring country. So Pakistan is making every attempt to rebuild from the losses that were suffered. And you might see these groups back in action very soon, which means India will have to maintain constant vigilance. So that is one key development with regard to the security developments in the region. Then coming back to economy, the central government has reopened the PLI scheme for white goods. It has been extended up to 14th October. From 15th September to 14th October, the white good PLI scheme has been reopened. Now, what do you mean by white goods? See, generally, white goods refer to any good which essentially is white in color or which is colorless. It primarily refers to large home appliances. For example, your refrigerator, air conditioners, washing machines, every other home appliance. Traditionally, they used to come only in white color. Of course, today there are different colors. Traditionally, all these large home appliances would be in white color. So these consumer oriented goods, large home appliances, which were in white color, they came to be referred to as white goods. Today, the term is used in other industries as well. For example, in spirit and alcohol and beverage industry, the colorless alcohols are referred to as white spirits, like vodka, tequila, gin, etc. Right? So this is a reference to those goods which are white in color or colorless, essentially. But when it comes to this particular context, it refers to home appliances. And under the production linked incentive scheme, the government has been encouraging the appliance industry to produce more in India, to produce the components, the spare parts, the raw materials, ensure that the whole supply chain is built up Because previously, India would import a lot of these appliances from South Korea, from Southeast Asian countries, from China, from Japan. So, under the PLI scheme, the government has been incentivizing domestic production to make India self reliant, Atmanirbhar, to create lakhs of jobs. So, incentives are provided by the government based on the production targets being met. And this scheme for white good industry, specifically for air conditioners and LED lights, it has been extended for one more month from 15th September to 14th October. So, government estimates that this extended window will bring additional 10,000 crores of investment, creating lakhs of jobs, providing for the domestic production of ACs and LED lights. Clear? Coming to the next topic, on the front page, there is an important article that relates to the pendency of cases in the higher judiciary, particularly at the Supreme Court. Supreme Court has been struggling with the piling up of cases. The backlog has been piling up month on month, despite the best efforts of the Supreme Court. Right now, we have seen the pendency reach a all-time high. 88,417 cases are pending, according to the National Judicial Data Grid, which is a national judicial database. So, according to this report, 88,417 cases are pending right now as a backlog, and this is the highest ever backlog. See, since the times of then Chief Justice D.Y. Chandrachud to the times of current Chief Justice B.R. Gavai, the Chief Justices have made very conscious attempts to ensure that there is not a single vacancy in the Supreme Court. The sanctioned strength is 34, 33 judges plus one Chief Justice. For most of the duration in the last, I would say, 3-4 years, the capacity has been filled with very minimal vacancies. Even the government has been quickly considering the collegium recommendations and quickly appointing the judges, sometimes within 48 hours, to ensure that not even for a single day vacancy is left in the Supreme Court panel. Despite this, despite the best efforts, the pendency of cases is piling up. Supreme Court used to take a summer holiday, a summer recess, and the recent chief justices have curtailed the summer recess, made it a partial working day, where the judges are taking turns to work for a few days, even during the recess period, to ensure that cases are cleared as quickly as possible. Currently, the disposal rate is at 80% of the cases filed. On an average, 5,600 to 6,000 cases are being disposed with the Supreme Court. But this is not enough. The rate at which pendency is piling, it has crossed the new cases already. Pendency is piling up, new cases are piling up, disposal rate has remained at 80%. So, out of the pending cases, 69,000 of them are civil cases, the rest 18,000 odd cases are criminal cases. So, to clear this backlog, the judiciary will have to put in more and more effort. The work burden on the 34 judges is increasing. So, even one vacancy for a month will create a backlog of easily at least 5,000 cases. Right? And if, let's say, there are 2-3 vacancies left for few days or few months, the pendency will quickly start piling up. That's why there's a lot of pressure on the collegium, the Supreme Court collegium, to ensure the vacancies are filled ASAP. Even the government has been quickly accepting the recommendations and appointing the judges, sometimes within 48 hours, to ensure that there is no gap or delay. And that is the effort being put in. But still, the legacy cases are building up. So this is where technology can play a bigger role, right? The judiciary has tried to bring in better technology for case management, for quick disposal of cases, quick hearings, virtual online hearings. But despite all these efforts, the pendency is essentially piling up. The problem is worse in terms of high courts, in terms of lower courts as well. So this has remained a persistent problem, and that is the need for judicial reforms to increase the capacity of the judiciary to handle more cases, given the size of the Indian population. This remains a persistent problem, and it's a key topic under judicial reforms. So with this, I complete all the major topics. Now let's take a quick look at the prelims section and look at the small articles in today's newspaper. On page 6, the Hindu carries this image. Any idea what does this image depict? It depicts the Erra Matti Dibbalu, the red sand dunes or the red sand hillocks, which are present on the outskirts of Vishakhapatnam in Andhra Pradesh. It's a very unique geological formation. for its bright red color, its unique composition, and it is seen as a geological heritage of India. It is recognized as a national geoheritage site. So now it has been placed on the tentative list of UNESCO's natural heritage site. That is the key development. In Telugu, Erra Matti means red sand. So red sand dunes, Erra Matti Dibbalu. So it's a national geoheritage site, recognized as a unique geological formation. Now it's been placed on the tangible list of UNESCO's natural heritage sites. Then the Prime Minister has inaugurated India's first ever bamboo based bioethanol plant. The ethanol production primarily uses sugarcane molasses as the feedstock, or even broken food grains as the feedstock, or even corn and other food edible items as the feedstock. But for the first time, not just in India but in the world, at the Numaligarh refinery in Assam, by using green bamboo, bioethanol has been produced. So this is a big milestone which could help India scale up ethanol production and ensure that it doesn't put stress on other edible food items which are often diverted towards the biofuel industry. So this is a big milestone. Along with this, the Prime Minister has inaugurated a polypropylene project at the Numaligarh refinery. It's a major oil refinery for India in Assam. In fact, from here we even supply diesel and petrochemical products to Bangladesh as well. India has a gas pipeline and a high-speed diesel pipeline through which we supply hydrocarbon and petrochemical products to Bangladesh as well. Next, the chief of Food and Agriculture Organization has called upon India to diversify its food production. Basically, he has given a message to India on food security, as India has the world's largest population and India faces significant climate threats which could affect agricultural production. He has given few advices to India on how India can diversify food production. The article itself is not too important, but this gives us an opportunity to talk about this organization, the FAO. It's one of the specialized agencies of the United Nations. It's part of the UN system. The Food and Agriculture Organization was established in 1945 and it is headquartered in Italy, in Rome. This organization plays a critical role in ensuring global food security. It also delivers food aid to regions hit by famines, to conflict zones, or where hunger, malnutrition is prevalent. The FAO has been constantly in the news in the context of Ukraine war, the civil war in Afghanistan, the civil wars in Yemen, and the famine in East Africa and North Africa. So, because of all these developments, FAO has been constantly in the news where it has been supplying food aid, ensuring food security. It will assist countries to step up their agricultural productivity, to deal with the impact of climate change as well. So, 195 members are part of it, 195 four states and the European Union, making it 195 members. India is a part of it as well. In fact, India has worked closely with Food and Agriculture Organization. So please note down it's a specialized agency of the UN established in 1945. Then coming to the last article today, a very interesting article. Under the economy section, we have this article that refers to something known as the pink tax. It's not a real tax imposed by the government. It's not a tax levied by the government. So what is this so-called pink tax? Pink tax is essentially the higher differential price that is imposed on products aimed at women customers. That is, if you see gender based differential pricing on a product, if products meant for women, if they are deliberately overpriced, that additional cost that companies are imposing on women is what is often referred to as pink tax. Now, take for example, I go for a haircut. Okay, I go to a salon. Maximum I'll pay 150 rupees to 200 rupees for a haircut. Right? Previously, I used to pay hardly 50 rupees. Now, maybe it's 150 to 200 rupees. Now, let's say my wife or my sister, they go to a salon, maybe the same salon to get a haircut. They end up paying 2000 rupees, 3000 rupees. What is so different about a haircut for a boy or a girl? Right? It's more or less The same process, the same equipment which is used. Yes, I agree. If you get some procedures done, let's say you color your hair, you dye your hair, the cost will increase. But still, it doesn't explain the pricing difference. Now you take any cosmetic product, skincare product, even healthcare products, you see a massive difference. There are few products specifically marketed for women, maybe razor blades, lotions, creams, moisturizers, right? Makeup products, skincare products, even toys, especially pink colored toys. So there is this trend in the market, which basically started in the United States. It started all in California in 1990s, where companies figured out that they could play on the insecurities of women, which is pushed by our judging society, where the society judges women based on their texture of skin, the color of the skin, right? So this prevalent patriarchal notions, orthodox notions, and stereotypes in the society, it plays on the insecurity of the women, as to how they look, how they appear, how they present themselves. And there's nothing wrong with that per se. Now, don't judge me for saying this. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But the problem is the industry capitalizes on this. Private companies are capitalizing on this, and they're overpricing the same products, the same services, which are specifically marketed for women. Essentially, this is gender based discrimination. Women are losing their money, losing their savings, right? So it's a debatable topic. So let me know what you think in the comments. I know looking good, appearing good is essential, appearing professional, but companies will capitalize on it. Now, this could apply for men as well, but usually men products meant for men are priced lower than compared to products which are exclusively marketed for women. So this is a deliberate psychological marketing tactic by these all these companies, which they try to do to increase their profit margins. So this additional price they impose on women-centric products is what is referred to as pink tax, which affects the savings of households. Exactly, it does have a larger economic impact. So let me know what is your view on this in the comment section. How much do you pay for a haircut, if you're a boy or if you're a girl? On this note, I bring my discussion to an end. I hope it was interesting analysis and I hope you have understood everything. If you like the session, do press the like button, share your comments, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Thanks for watching.